Welcome to Compass, finding the divine in the everyday. I'm your host, Ryan Dunn. Michelle Maldonado is off in Burundi, I believe. In this episode, though, we're joined by Reverend Mark Feldmeir. This is going to be a profound exploration of God's power and its impact on our understanding of spirituality. We're continuing a series about challenging questions of faith. And in this episode, our key question is, where do you see the action of God? Mark takes us on a journey through his personal experiences and struggles with the conventional conceptions of God that he was taught to believe in. As we navigate through Mark's story, we discover how his encounters with challenging questions in academic studies, particularly those around the Holocaust, led Mark to question how an all-powerful God could allow such suffering. This exploration ultimately led Mark to a new understanding of God's power, one that is not really coercive or unilateral, but rather persuasive. Mark helps with theodicy, the reconciliation of God's all-powerful and all-loving nature, and invites us to consider new expressions of understanding God's power. That's a lot, but it's all really uplifting and inspiring, so stick with us. And while you're listening, do us a solid favor and drop a rating and review. Reviews help our visibility and assist more people in discovering the perspectives that we can share on Compass. And let me tell you a little bit more about Reverend Mark Feldmeir. Mark is pastor of St. Andrew United Methodist Church in Highlands Ranch, Colorado. He holds an MDiv from Claremont School of Theology, where he has taught homiletics courses, in addition to speaking at conferences about preaching, politics, and pop culture. I guess the big 3 Ps. He's written 4 books, including A House Divided, Engaging the Issues Through the Politics of Compassion, and most recently, Life After God, Finding Faith When You Can't Believe, which just came out in August of 2023. So let's get to the theodicy and a whole lot more on this episode of Compass. Pastor Mark, really appreciative of you joining us on the Compass podcast. How goes it with your soul today?
Great question, Ryan. My soul is good. It's a Monday, and so for many of us in ordained ministry, full-time parish work, Mondays are the kind of the days of recovery, and I take Fridays off, so even my Mondays are pretty full. So I'm never at my best, and my soul is ready and open for receiving on Mondays. So. We had a good day of worship yesterday, and just getting off to a new week here.
Did you preach yesterday?
I did. I preached yesterday on the story of Elijah and the call of God to lure him out of his cave and back into the real world and to get back to work.
Okay, and now here you are on a Monday. Yeah, we're doing this interview. Lucky you. Yeah. Well, oh man, I feel kind of bad now that I'm starting off with such a big encompassing question, but it is something that you've already addressed. So maybe it's a bit of a softball for you, but you've written that we have a quote unquote God problem in the modern world. Can you sum up for us what that God problem is?
Yeah. I think I try to describe the God problem as one of perception or conception rather than one of experience. And so what we know from much of the demographic work that's being done on Christians in general and younger Christians in particular is that there's still a deep receptivity and longing for what we might call spiritual experiences that wouldn't fall into the category of sort of conventional orthodoxy, conventional, historical, traditional Christian understandings of who God is. And some of that, I think, has to do with the fact that what we know are 2 things. One, those that are less receptive to traditional understandings of God and Christianity in particular are those that are younger, that is millennials and younger, and those that B are more self-described as liberal, in thinking, whether that's political, social, theological, cultural, those that identify as being more liberal or progressive on issues, both theological and social. And so what we have is a struggle with people coming to understand the God that they've been told about and taught about in their churches over the years, and that has been handed down over many, many centuries of Christian transmission. And so at the heart of that, my argument is that at the heart of that problem is one of conception, that we have these ideas of who God is, specifically attributes of God that we think are that we are required to hold as certain and non-negotiable. So some of those attributes that we've inherited traditionally about God are about God's power, about God's knowledge, about God's love, and about the future that God seems to have planned out for us in advance. And these and many other, not to even mention conceptions of heaven and hell and God's judgment. My argument in the book is that many of these conventions of God that we've created over the centuries are far more influenced by philosophical thought, and in particular Western philosophical thought over the last 2,000 years plus, than they are descriptions of who God is. And so where I find in my conversations with folks who are struggling with faith or who simply don't go to church, they are less inclined to discount deep spiritual experiences, which they might describe as spiritual adventures, experiences that get them out into the world, into nature, meditational practices, these kinds of things. But they're all experienced outside the walls of the church and outside of a Sunday morning sermon. So that's the nature of the problem, is how we've come to describe God and understand God conventionally, as opposed to how more and more people today are really living these experiences of the divine that don't fit into those categories.
There's a recent article that's gone viral, I think released last week or the week prior, from U.S. News and World Report that, really just talked about the cultural trend that you just spoke to, that that there is a longing in a younger generation to have experiences of God, but it's also very individualized. So they are definitely seeking it beyond the walls, as you put it, of the traditional church. But still that same longing is there. And of course, with that then comes all kinds of questions about, the knowability of God, and what are some practices in which we do find ourselves in community experiencing God. And sometimes when we're not able to, or when I think what happens oftentimes in churches is that we propose to know an answer. And when that answer does not work for somebody, then they tend to leave the faith. And our answers can often kind of lean towards the academic or the thoughtful, and away from the experiential, as you've put it. You did bring up early in your book about going to seminary, this place where we explore God in a thoughtful way. Sometimes the experiential comes in. You wrote that you went to seminary to become a pastor, and in that process, you lost your faith. Can you describe the faith that you lost?
Yeah. And how I frame that is never in that experience going through seminary and post-seminary did I lose a very rich assurance of God's presence in my life. There were times where that presence seemed thin and distant, but never did I find myself doubting that there was a God, or even that there was a very real and present God in my life. But where the crisis occurred for me was around, again, some of these conceptions of God that I was told one way or another, and maybe I told myself this, that this is the God I have to believe in order to have a faith that is within the bounds of orthodoxy and not
Yeah.
heretical, if you will. And so for me, that crisis occurred around this this paradox, this dilemma that we would describe as theodicy. Theos meaning God, dike meaning justice, and the work of theodicy is to try to reconcile this paradox of God's all-powerful nature and God's all-loving nature, and to say bad things happen in the world, bad things happen in our lives, and if God truly is all-powerful, and God is all-loving, why didn't God intervene as an act of love to prevent me or the world from suffering? And so part of this came out of my own experience in undergrad work. I actually majored in religious studies. And so I was familiar with many theological concepts. I was raised in the church. I was particularly in tune with the plight of the Jews through their whole lived experience, but in particular the Holocaust, and trying to understand how the worst expression of genocide on the planet, how do we speak of God in that context? And so I had a particular professor that I describe in the book who challenged me on my own understandings of how an all-powerful God can also be an all-loving God. And through that process, understood that my understandings of the power of God had to change in order for me to affirm that God is indeed all-loving. And so that journey led me to new expressions of how we understand God's power. And to say that God's power is not one of coercion, not one of unilateral activity in our lives in which God's intervening in the everyday events to make things happen or to not make things happen, prevent things. But that maybe the work of God is less coercive and more persuasive. And then we understand that in our lives and in the world, evil exists. God didn't create this evil. God simply gives us the agency and power to resist evil, and in the process continues to call us or persuade us toward the good. So that in every moment, both good and evil are before us, and we can choose either one. And God, it's not only that God allows these things to happen, but that God doesn't have the power to intervene in these events, in the events of evil that we would describe. And so with that, I could affirm fully the love of God that is present everywhere and always for all people in every moment. And so it was through the doorway or the gateway of theodicy that I came to then reimagine other concepts of God that were less orthodox, but my argument is far more biblical. Both Hebrew and Christian scriptures would validate.
With the idea of God being this kind of divine inviter, there might be a sense that God is a bit disconnected from the actions of the world, that, God is kind of this divine watchmaker. I believe you wrote about that as well. And then invites us to be a part of the process. So in accepting that God is that divine inviter and God is active in the world, have there been some moments when you've seen evidence of the movement of God, or were there some God sightings that led you into this new understanding of faith?
Yeah. Let me frame that response by saying my own personal experience has been that those God sightings, often we only can feel a degree of certainty about them once they're over. In looking back, that may be a momentary, like we just experienced this, and moments later we say that was it. It could be that we experienced something years ago and look back and we begin to connect the dots and say what many would describe as this predestined, predetermined plan for our lives starts to look more like a broader purpose, if you will. This idea that God has for us about our ideal future, and then persuades or invites. I like the language lure as well, or beckons us toward choosing those best options for us in every given moment. And when we do that, we have these little whispers. To use the language of the Elijah story that I preached on yesterday, the sound of sheer silence, as it's called, or other versions, the gentle whisper or the still small voice. Those are so often spoken in the small, the ordinary, and the imperfect expressions of our daily lives. And so I can look back and say, there actually seemed to be some purpose to me being in a room with a professor who challenged me on my theodicy, that then broke open this new and rather painful and long journey toward reconstruction of my faith. That some would call that providence. I use providence more loosely because it seems like, again, God is sort of orchestrating rather than inviting. And I want to affirm at all times human agency in the pursuit of the God life. But I can look at that. I'm a pastor today in a church just outside of Denver. I've been here a little over 9 years and was born and raised in Southern California. Never thought I would leave California ever. Was pastoring a church in San Diego. I could see the beach every day. I get a call out of the blue from a bishop inviting me to think about a cross-conference transfer to come to Denver to pastor a church that was in significant turmoil at the time, and a very important strategic church to our denomination. And so I am inclined to say there's a prompting here, and I want to pay attention to it. And so my original impulse to say no led me to some deeper discernment and prayer about how God might be involved in this. And over the next few days, I found myself persuaded to say yes to something I never imagined possible. So these are, I mean, it would be great to get a thundering voice, burning bush,
yeah, right,
a visit from an angel, or some words in neon lights in the dark sky. I think most of the time what we encounter instead is this loaded silence of God, which is not evidence of God's absence, but requires us to listen deeply to where and how God is calling us. And that sort of defines not only my personal life, but it defines my ministry as a pastor. Yeah.
Well, if you don't mind me asking about that experience of call to Colorado, it wasn't an easy move, I imagine. You have a family, so they would have had to be a part of this as well. And no doubt, I mean, anytime you leave a church family behind, there are feelings of mourning that accompany that. So it's not necessarily just a simple invitation to come from San Diego to Colorado. What were the feelings or the moments or points of evidence that felt like a compelling movement for you to accept this call to Colorado?
For me in that moment, it was a discernment around what my unique gifts are for ministry and whether or not those gifts were still needed in the current context that I was in, as much as I love that space. But knowing what the unique and very, very deep needs of my current church were at the time, and this sense that I could do it, that I had the unique gifts that maybe others didn't have. I was not the first to be invited to consider this church. And who knows, maybe I was the last. And that's fine too. But there was this sense of deep need that was being met, to use sort of Frederick Buechner's imagery of our deepest joys or gifts meeting or intersecting with the world's deepest needs. I take that language. I thought there was a very unique intersection there, and that invited me into that space. And to my point earlier, I didn't know in the first couple of years whether that was the best move at that time of my life. I came in 2014. I didn't know until maybe 2017 that it was the right move for me. I had glimpses of it, but looking back, I can say, as the psalmist says, what is it, Psalm 139 maybe, or 39, where the psalmist is looking back and saying, as he went through the sea, he wasn't sure, but looking back, he can see the footsteps of God walking with him. I think that's how most of the time we envision our future as playing out according to some purpose by looking back in time.
There have been any moments recently that have inspired your faith, or where you have felt like, oh, this has been a movement of God?
Well, I wrote this book, and the book has been described by a lot of reviewers as a new, more progressive apologetic, which is true, and yet that wasn't the purpose. It is intended to be a book that is one of both deconstruction and reconstruction. And almost daily, I hear from readers from around the country who email me and indicate where it was in certain points in the book that touched them and that helped them. I had conversations every Sunday with people at my current church at St. Andrew who say, I didn't have the words to give voice to this experience, and you're helping me do that. I take immense pride and joy and delight in that feedback, where I know I'm walking beside people and I'm not too far ahead of people in this journey, and that they find some resonance and some connection with what I'm trying to do. That inspires me personally to continue to do the work I'm doing, and to enter into these new spaces about how we understand God, to give ourselves permission to do that. I've come to see that most of our experiences with God are, as to use that old sort of cliche, like the blind man reaching and feeling around different parts of the elephant and trying to describe what the elephant is. And a lot of Christians, they get together and one of us is feeling the trunk, and it feels soft and even moist, and others are feeling like a tusk, and it feels sharp and smooth and hard, and others feel a leg, and it's leathery, and we're all naming this experience. Where we fail is that we stop exploring the elephant. We just stop with the first thing we feel, and we describe that as God. When the journey of faith is to continue to explore, and when we do that, we find less division in our conversations about faith, for that matter, about how God works in the world and why our world is the way it is. And we have more conversation about what your experience means to mine and where I might go next to explore. My personal life is one that says I want to continue to feel around that elephant and continue to describe it the best I can, and to walk with people who are doing that too.
Yeah. How do you name that as a value for your faith community, for your congregation? Do you find that it's something that you have to keep reminding people of, like, oh, we're all, to continue on the analogy that we're all feeling around the elephant and we're going to have our different experiences?
I think the work that we've done at St. Andrew is one where one of our great values is discovery. And one of the points of real concern for us as a people is around certainty. And so As Anselm of the 10th, 11th century said, theology is, as he described it, faith-seeking intelligence or understanding. I think in the modern world, we've transcribed that to mean faith-seeking certainty. And when we reach a point of certainty, that's where we stop growing as people of faith. And so a big part of my preaching and my teaching is one of saying faith-seeking understanding is the work that we need to be doing. And not only understanding as it relates to the mind, but faith-seeking experience. And the deeper we get into real lived human experience, to get outside of our brains and onto our feet using our hands. An example would be last summer I took a group of young adults, a dozen young adults from my congregation. We went to walk a portion of the Camino de Santiago in Spain, 1,000-year-old pilgrimage trail that Christians have been walking, and there was no there was no deliberate, intentional, educational component to that, except along the way we're going to walk, we're going to talk. When we're finished, we're going to do a spiritual exercise. When we begin, we'll do a spiritual exercise. But let's get on our feet. Let's get into the world. And out of that experience, I think we all felt some transformation that we couldn't do inside the walls of our church in the pews. So again, it's another part of the elephant. Yeah.
Yeah. And again, it seems to pull back to that experiential, where the only named objective that it seemed that you had on that trip was just to provide an experience that may lead to a sense of God's movement. I feel like we're going to have to link the sermon that you just gave last weekend, because I'm going to go back and talk about it again. But you were preaching about Elijah, and in order to have that kind of experience, it seemed that Elijah retreated to a cave, right? That's what allowed Elijah the space to kind of reflect on God's movement. Are there any specific habits or specific spiritual practices that you employ regularly, maybe more often than your pilgrimage to Spain, that help you cultivate an awareness of God's presence or movement?
Holding a diversity of practices that don't allow me to fall into some predictable pattern, because with those patterns and habits, we can immediately either get legalistic about it, or and that fades into sort of this boredom around what we do. So I try to mix it up. A few things that tend to work really well for me in connecting me with the divine. I have practices where I follow a portion of the daily offices, which is just, there are 3 daily offices throughout the day. You can do just one, which I do, a simple prayer, a quick scripture reading, a time for reflection. That has worked historically really well for me. Not lengthy practices, but moments where I can regather myself. I take breathing and practices of breathing seriously. I use an app to do that because it forces me to slow down. I do walk, and I'm a pretty avid cyclist, and so these getting into my body is really important, because I tend to live in my head. That's just the way I'm wired. And so the more physical I can get, the more I seem to access spiritual energy. And when I have a chance, I do some fly fishing. And here in Colorado, to be out in the mountains, and there's nobody around to listen, to hear, to feel, to sense. Every sensory is touched there. And so those are important. And I would say that the last one, and maybe this doesn't seem like a practice, but I've tried to make it a practice. I do a lot of sort of one-on-one with people in my office. They're going through a crisis or a transition in their life, or having questions. And I try to encounter the other in these moments. through spiritual practice, to be present, to be deeply mindful of the other, to ask questions that invite the other, invite me into their space. And so, as maybe odd as it sounds, conversation with the other is for me a spiritual practice where I acknowledge in my own mind that the one before me is an expression of the divine. And how do I find that connection?
That's reassuring to hear from a person in leadership, because it seems that you're approaching these conversations with a sense that you have something to receive from the other person.
In the book, I described one individual who had a significant impact on me, and I only knew him by his first name. His name was Thomas, and he was basically a wandering preacher who had no home in Southern California and would come to visit me once a month. And his only request was that he could pray over me and bless me. And Thomas and I had this unlikely, remarkable friendship for about 5 years. And it was because I was open to this stranger who didn't look like me, whose story was completely unlike mine, well, at least from outward appearances, and yet came with a deep sense of grace and invited me to receive. And so I learned a lot from Thomas, and I try to continue that tradition.
Well, Pastor Mark, thank you for lending your time to us today and for lending your wisdom. We have been hopefully open and receiving here as well. It's been a pleasure speaking with you and touching on some of the things that you lift up in life after God. Is a good place to get a hold of you or to follow up on some of the things that you're working on?
MarkFeldmeir.com is your website. Is my website. You can learn a little bit more about me, and I always post material there that people can download. And the St. Andrew website, which is gosaintandrew.com, has all my messages that are easy to find, and both video and audio.
Perfect.
Thanks for
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Compass. Hey, if you found this episode meaningful, I definitely think that you're going to like our episode with Josh Scott about making sense of the Bible. It was episode 117. And episode 107 with Casey Tigrit about restlessness and faith is going to connect well too. I'm Ryan Dunn. Michelle and I will be back in another 2 weeks with a fresh episode of Compass. Compass is a production of United Methodist Communications. You can find out all about Compass and see notes and other episodes at umc.org/compass. Talk to you in a couple weeks. Peace.